Mic on.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, my question I just wanted to know a little bit more. I mean, I really like the account and the historical interconnections, and also the sense of he should have read Suarez and he could have done better. But I was wondering about just how it fits in the mature view. So especially with the moral issues that you bring up exactly rightly. So in particular, there is this question about what determines my noumenal character or essence. And so I think, as you pointed out, that something about my free acts constitute that essence. But then there's also the fact that God creates that essence or substance that has that essence. And so do you think that in the constitution of the essence itself just maybe possible before God creates it, that there's my free acts making that up, and if so, are they acting as efficient causes in some sense in the realm of possibles? And if that's right, that there's a kind of efficient causal constitution in the realm of possibles, then God's choice to realize that or make that substance actual wouldn't be determining the noumenal character in the same way that the quasi, real but only possible efficient free active causal powers would be making up the noumenal character. So I didn't know if you thought Kant could have something like that kind of distinction at the noumenal level, and if there would be similar questions about concurrence concurrence versus, conservation at the noumenal level. But
I thought I was following you for a minute, but then when you introduced the possibles, I think I lost you. There is this big problem of theological determinism. So the San Diego School of Eric Watkins, Kim Brewer have a Kant Studien article. It's forthcoming, is that right? In which they express optimism that this problem in this passage can be solved. And Bob expressed some optimism, I think, in his Malebranche paper, that it's not an insoluble problem, this extreme dependence plus libertarian freedom in principle. So Kant obviously believes that we have to have both sides. We have to go for both of them. My point here was maybe Eric doesn't agree. He seems to give up too soon in coming up with a model of how that is supposed to work. What is the causal model? I mean, he seems to say clearly in a few passages like this that it's a mystery to us. We can never, ever understand it. This is why the sunny San Diego School, I'm not sure if that's meant as a interpretation of Kant or a solution to Kant's problem, but maybe a little bit of both. But Kant himself doesn't give us that much guidance here, I'm afraid. We should talk maybe a bit more about this.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Wonderful talk. I agree with, at least 99.9% of everything. So, and in fact, sort of as an autobiographical note, I had studied with Fred Ferdoso at Notre Dame and worked, and when Bob Slay was there, took a class Leibniz, and so I was very familiar with these issues in the same way in which you are. And then I too turned to Kant thinking, he's a smart guy, let's see what's going on. And I came to a very similar conclusion. So, I mean, I had high hopes, and then
Dashed.
the answer, well, I don't know about dashed, but I just don't think he's thinking about this at the level of sophistication that, say, Leibniz was, or Suarez perhaps too. So that doesn't mean that there aren't lots of interesting things going on, though, and I appreciate the way you laid them all out. One thing, I think you just skipped over this for the sake of time, but I mean, one thought that I think might have tempted him in this context is, in the dissertation, he makes this distinction between the possible causal influences between things that constitute the essential form of the world and the actual influences, right? And obviously, the finite substances can't be, well, it seems obvious, perhaps to me, that the substances can't be responsible for the possible influences. I mean, that's what you need God for. But then once you set it up that way, then it looks like, well, what is going to be responsible for the actual influences? Well, God's sort of done his part by making certain things possible, and then it's the substances that are going to go and do their thing and make, one set actual versus another, say.
Right, right.
And why not just go one step further and say, oh, well, to the extent that my actually doing it requires that it be possible, God's concurring by making it possible. Because he could have said, no, that's just, I'm not going to let that even be a possibility for you. So he doesn't put it in those terms, but one might think of that as a kind of...
Yes.
So
I had the same thought. I thought maybe you could make a model of concurrence out of this.
Yeah.
But I found that, first of all, he uses the language of conservation in describing God's act there, the connecting act. And secondly, there is this text which is on the handout but not in the printed paper on page 3, an early note from the 1760s, where he says, Von Gott kann man nicht sagen, dass zu demjenigen, was nach mechanischen Gesetzen geschieht, konkurriere, insofern der Autor dieser Ordnung ist. Zum Beispiel, dass Gott zu der Fruchtbarkeit der Jahreszeit im Sommer konkurriere. So that's exactly the same argument we looked at in the lay text, that if God is producing it as it's acting by a necessity of nature, you cannot say that God is concurring with it. So he seems to be setting himself apart there from the concurrentists quite early on. And I think one reason is he thinks they're trying to derive concurrence from conservation, and yet they're saying concurrence is something more than conservation. So if you look in Baumgarten, you look in Meyer, you look in Wolff, and you look in Leibniz, they all seem to be saying concurrence is something more than conservation. Durandus is a bad man. He didn't have this extra thing he should have. And then Kant, I think, sees, well, they're also saying, Leibniz is offering this argument that if you consider carefully what conservation is, you will see that it must have some relation to that which is conserved. And that leads you to the concurrentist position. And I think he thinks, which is it? Is it something more, or is it just concurrence? If you analyze concurrence very carefully, you see it involves a reference to that which is conserved. If you want to say it's something more, don't try and derive it from conservation. That's a way of putting a positive spin on his objection, right? I think that's a decent enough kind of argument.
One little further point. I wanted to pick up on what Dan was saying about how there is a further story that needs to be told about phenomenal causation, and obviously it's messy and complicated, but just wanted to see if you had sort of a general take on this along the following lines. I mean, he does say in the second analogy that God can't create appearances, right? He can create only basically things in themselves.
Right.
So it's clear that appearances don't depend on God. So that would, immediately, right? And so, and then you did seem to say that our freedom determines certain things in some sense independently of God. So would you agree then, or does it follow then that appearances are completely independent of God and depend solely on freedom, or are there further?
No, I would rank them with in the pre-critical philosophy. God creates, conserves the substance creates the accidents. And in the critical philosophy, I think he's using the appearance as the model of the accident there that arises out of what God creates and conserves at the noumenal level is the noumenal substance. Consider the appearance as some kind of accident of that, because obviously if God just creates that and everything else arises out of it, there is some kind of analogy there. And just as he said in the pre-critical philosophy, God doesn't create immediately make the modification or the property. He says in the critical philosophy, God doesn't immediately cause the appearances. What he causes is the substance. So that's just an expression of his mere conservationism is what I would say there about that.
Just very, very quickly now. So what about phenomenal substances and his remarks about how space might be a kind of divine omnipresent, mode of divine omnipresence?
Yeah.
Maybe I just want to say, it gets very complicated and not ask you anything.
Yes. Well, you could say that's where he's emphasizing the dependence thought once again. So in the pre-critical philosophy, even though he's a mere conservationist, he really likes this image. God has to conserve the things in interaction for them to be in interaction. And space is the phenomenon or the appearance of that. So you focus on what is the ultimate metaphysical ground of that, God's particular action, and you see space as the omnipresence of God. And he likes this Newtonian image, or a version of this Newtonian image. And he even compares it at one point to Malebranche. He says, this comes quite close to what Malebranche says when he says we see all things in God. We see all things in space. And a version of that, but it's rather tamed down, does survive into the critical period,
All right, we've got just 5 minutes left, and we've got Marilyn and Nancy. So if I could ask you, you'll see. All right, Nancy. Thank you, Marilyn. I wanted to ask the question because of the one of the central features of the research project is to have the different disciplines reinforcing and feeding and getting ideas from each other. So I have a general question about the no splitting criterion or no splitting demand. And it's a question that is, I want to raise it because it's important in contemporary philosophy of science. So if the moderns had something helpful to say here, we should hear it. And it's that I don't understand how splitting is possible, what it would be like for splitting to happen, even if it weren't God who was one of the splitters. There's one model that is available that everyone buys, which is that there's an effect which has parts, genuinely has parts, and each cause brings one of the parts. You build a wall, each cause brings a brick. That's the model of classical mechanics. The total force is made up of component forces which are contributed by different causes. But I take it that there's a more ambitious project where one cause, in a sense, sets the stage or constraints, and the other cause, it's like the one sets the determinable and the other sets the determinate within it. And there are no acceptable models in contemporary philosophy of science that I know about how that happens. I have happened to argue for metaphysics in which it has to happen. And so I know that as soon as I start talking about this, it keeps always getting reduced to the first case. So I'm really interested in how anybody thought splitting could happen when it wasn't the simple bit, each guy brings his brick.
Right. Thank you.
And it wasn't just for you, that was for sort of everyone who has ever looked at a splitting argument or has an idea.
So the concurrentists who were looking at this, they were trying to come up with a model that would, in some sense, allow a split, but it wasn't a split that would violate their view that without God, the creature could do nothing. And some of them were attracted, according to Freddoso, to an instrumental model of causation. So I think Freddoso at one point uses the model of writing on the blackboard with a piece of chalk. So the thoughts are due to me, the whiteness of the letters are due to the chalk. I don't know if that particular splitting model corresponds to each bringing its own brick.
Well, that's just how that gets parsed is different effects, right? Because effects come under descriptions, and the whiteness is due to X, and it's not like I decide it should be colored, and I mean I make it colored and you make it red. Yeah. Which is, I thought, one of the examples that I was made to think of from some of the things you said.
So, yeah, you have to think of it as one effect. The worry is, of course, for a lot of these people is that they end off coming up with the each cause brings its own effect kind of model, and then concurrence collapses into a kind of conservationism, because the worry then is that the creaturely cause is bringing its own effect and it's doing something, but then the creaturely cause can do something without God's concurrence. So Durandus uses this as an argument. He says if you're driven here by the intuition as a concurrentist that the creature can't do anything on its own, why aren't you faced with this puzzle? You try and ascribe a part of an effect to the creature. I say to you, but the creature can't do anything on its own. And so you have to say that, well, God concurs in that part somehow, or that component of the effect. And you say, well, so you reduce the creature's contribution, as it were, and then you repeat the argument. And you find that the concurrentist is pushed back to occasionalism and is going to have to say that God does everything, because they can't split the effect in any acceptable way, and so they can't ascribe anything to the creature. Now, Bob, I think, was more optimistic about